Hello everyone, if you enjoy my channel, please support me with one like, one subscribe, and one share.
I thought credit cards were dangerous. Have you ever believed something so strongly that it quietly controlled your life without you noticing? I did. I thought credit cards were dangerous. I believed they were nothing more than shiny pieces of plastic designed to trap people in endless debt. That belief felt safe. It felt smart. But one ordinary afternoon in the United States, that single belief almost cost me something far more valuable than money. It nearly changed the future of my family, my confidence, and even the way I understood trust. If you have ever wondered why Americans seem to love credit cards so much, stay with me. The answer surprised me more than anything else I have experienced, and it began on a completely normal day that I will never forget. My name is Emily, and this is my story. I live a quiet life with my husband and our children in the United States. Our days are simple. Sometimes the biggest lessons hide inside the smallest moments, waiting until you are ready to see them. While I was practicing my English every day, I enjoyed listening carefully to short conversations in stores because they helped me learn natural expressions. One sentence kept appearing everywhere. Would you like to pay with your credit card? I heard it again and again. Almost everyone smiled, tapped a card, thanked the cashier, and walked away as if nothing unusual had happened. I never understood why. Whenever it was my turn, I reached for my debit card or cash. It made me feel responsible. In my mind, avoiding credit cards meant avoiding trouble. I even felt a little proud of myself. I quietly thought I was making the wiser decision. My husband never laughed at me. Instead, he would simply smile and say, "Maybe one day you'll see it differently." His answer always made me curious, but I never asked another question because I believed I already knew the truth. Then something unexpected happened. One Saturday afternoon, we visited a local furniture store because our old dining table had finally become too small for family dinners. We found the perfect table. It was beautiful without being expensive. The salesperson greeted us warmly and explained that there was a special promotion ending that evening. Families using a qualified credit card would receive extra protection, extended warranty coverage, and reward points that could be used for future household purchases. I immediately shook my head. "No, thank you," I answered politely. "We'll just use our debit card." The salesperson smiled kindly, but I noticed a brief look of surprise. My husband looked at me with the same calm expression I knew so well. He did not argue. He did not pressure me. He simply asked one gentle question. "Are you sure we're saving money by saying no?" That question stayed in my mind for the rest of the day. On the drive home, I watched countless cars passing us under the warm American sunset. I wondered how many of those families used credit cards differently than I imagined. Were they all making a mistake? Or was I the one misunderstanding something important? For the first time, I realized I had never actually learned how credit worked in everyday American life. I had only collected fears, assumptions, and stories from other people. Suddenly, those stories no longer felt as solid as they once had. That evening, after the children had gone to bed, my husband quietly placed 2 cups of tea on the kitchen table. He looked at me with a gentle smile and said, "Emily, can I show you something that completely changed the way I think about credit?" I nodded, expecting a short conversation. I had no idea that the next 30 minutes would completely challenge everything I believed about money, marriage, and trust in America, and one shocking fact he showed me made me wonder why nobody had ever explained it this way before. One conversation changed my marriage. I thought I was protecting our family, but I was actually holding us back. That sentence still echoes in my mind because it was the moment everything began to change. I expected my husband to convince me to use a credit card. Instead, he showed me something much deeper. It had nothing to do with spending more money. It had everything to do with trust. That evening, sitting together in our quiet kitchen while the children slept upstairs, I discovered why so many Americans value credit far differently than I had imagined, and what I learned almost made me laugh at my own assumptions. The kitchen was peaceful except for the soft sound of the dishwasher. My husband opened his laptop and didn't show me a shopping website or a bank advertisement. Instead, he drew two simple circles on a sheet of paper. In one circle he wrote, money. In the other, he wrote, trust. Then he looked at me and asked, which one do you think a credit score measures? Without hesitation I answered, money. He smiled warmly and gently shook his head. Not exactly. It measures how consistently people can trust you to keep your promises. That answer surprised me more than I wanted to admit. No one had ever explained it in such a simple way. He continued by giving me an example that sounded almost too ordinary to matter. Imagine two neighbors, he said. Both earn similar incomes. One always pays every bill on time, keeps balances low, and plans carefully. The other forgets payments, borrows more than necessary, and ignores deadlines. Who would you trust? I immediately answered, the first one. He nodded. That's exactly how many financial systems in America work. They reward reliable habits, not perfect people. For a few seconds, I didn't say anything. I realized I had spent years judging the tool instead of understanding the behavior behind it. The credit card itself wasn't the hero or the villain. It was simply a tool. The real story was about discipline, responsibility, and consistency. Somehow, that idea felt strangely comforting. The next morning, I paid closer attention while running errands. At the grocery store, I noticed a young couple buying diapers, milk, and fresh vegetables. They smiled, tapped a credit card, thanked the cashier, and left without excitement. At a nearby coffee shop, an older gentleman paid the same way. No one looked worried. No one acted like they were chasing debt. It was simply another part of everyday American life. For the first time, I stopped asking, why do they all use credit cards? Instead, I began asking, what do they understand that I don't? While waiting in line, I practiced a little English in my head. The cashier smiled and asked, credit or debit? I repeated the sentence quietly after she said it. Then I practiced another useful expression, I'll use my card, please. They were simple words, but suddenly they carried a completely different meaning. I wasn't just learning English anymore. I was slowly learning the culture behind the language. That evening, my husband showed me something else. He opened a chart explaining payment history, credit utilization, and responsible borrowing. He wasn't trying to impress me with numbers. He was teaching me that small habits repeated month after month could quietly shape opportunities in the future. It reminded me of learning English. One conversation each day seemed insignificant, yet after months of practice, I could understand people more naturally. Good credit, he explained, worked in a surprisingly similar way. I leaned back in my chair and smiled. So Americans don't love credit cards because they love debt, I said slowly. They love what responsible credit can help them build. My husband nodded. Exactly. I thought that was the biggest lesson of the week. I was completely wrong. Just 3 days later, one unexpected phone call forced me to make a decision I had been avoiding for years. What happened next tested everything I had just learned, and one tiny mistake nearly erased my growing confidence before it even had a chance to grow. Everyone used credit, except me. 3 days. That was all it took for everything I had confidently believed to collide with reality. I thought I finally understood why Americans loved credit cards, but life decided to test me immediately. One unexpected phone call, one ordinary family decision. And one simple question forced me to choose between staying inside my comfort zone or trusting what I had just learned. Looking back now, I realize that moment had very little to do with a piece of plastic. It had everything to do with fear, and fear has a clever way of disguising itself as wisdom. The call came on a quiet Tuesday afternoon while I was folding laundry in the living room. My husband's name appeared on my phone. His voice sounded calm, but I could tell he was excited. Emily, he said, remember the dining table we liked? The store extended the promotion for one more day. If we still want it, we should decide tonight. I looked around at our old table, covered with tiny scratches from family dinners, homework sessions, birthday candles, and children's art projects. It had served us well, but it was becoming too small for our growing family. My first reaction surprised even me. No, I answered almost automatically. Let's wait. There was a short silence. My husband didn't argue. He simply asked, are you waiting because it's the right financial decision, or because you're still afraid of credit cards? His question followed me for the rest of the afternoon. Later, while shopping for groceries, I began noticing details I had ignored for years. A young mother in front of me smiled while paying with her credit card and immediately checked a budgeting app on her phone. An elderly couple used a rewards card for their weekly groceries and happily joked with the cashier about earning enough points for another family. Road trip. A college student politely asked whether paying the balance immediately through the banking app was the best habit. None of these people looked careless. They looked organized. Standing there in line, I quietly practiced another useful English expression I had just learned. I'd like to pay with my credit card. I whispered the sentence softly to myself, almost like a listening exercise. The pronunciation felt smoother than before. Learning English this way suddenly became enjoyable because every phrase belonged to a real moment instead of a textbook. Language felt alive when it was connected to everyday life. That evening, curiosity finally defeated fear. Instead of avoiding the topic, I asked my husband dozens of questions. What happens if someone pays the full balance every month? Why do banks care about payment history? Why do so many families use one card for daily expenses instead of carrying cash? Patiently, he answered every question. Then he opened our monthly household budget. Seeing everything organized on one screen was unexpectedly reassuring. He explained that the goal was never to spend more. The goal was to make planned purchases, pay on time, avoid unnecessary interest, and gradually build a strong credit history. Responsible credit creates future options, he said. Irresponsible spending creates future stress. For the first time, those words truly made sense. I realized something else that evening. The biggest obstacle wasn't the credit card. It was my pride. I had been so convinced I was right that I never stopped long enough to learn how the system actually worked. That realization was uncomfortable, but strangely freeing. Growth often begins the moment we become willing to replace assumptions with understanding. The next morning, I made a decision that honestly scared me. I told my husband, I'm ready to learn. But I want to do it the right way. He smiled. I believed I was finally prepared for my first confident decision about credit. But before we reached the checkout counter, an unexpected conversation with the store manager revealed one hidden rule about credit in America that almost nobody had ever mentioned to me, and hearing it made my heart skip a beat. My biggest credit mistake. I thought I had finally figured everything out. I believed all I had to do was use a credit card carefully, pay on time, and life would become easier. But the biggest surprise was still waiting for me. It wasn't a scam. It wasn't hidden debt. It wasn't even a huge purchase. My biggest mistake came from one tiny detail that almost everyone overlooks at the beginning. It took less than a minute to happen, but the lesson stayed with me forever, and if someone had explained it to me sooner, I could have avoided weeks of unnecessary stress. When my husband and I returned to the furniture store, I felt surprisingly confident. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of hearing the words, credit card. Instead, I was curious. The same friendly manager greeted us and remembered our conversation from a few days earlier. After we selected the dining table, he smiled and said, "Congratulations. You're making a thoughtful decision." Then he added something unexpected. "Just remember, building credit isn't about using your card a lot. It's about using it wisely." That single sentence stayed in my mind. On the drive home, I asked my husband what the manager meant. He explained that many people mistakenly believed spending more would automatically build a better credit history. In reality, responsible habits mattered much more than large purchases. Paying every statement on time, keeping balances low compared to the available credit, and avoiding unnecessary debt were the habits that quietly built trust over time. "Think of it like learning English," he said with a smile. "You don't become fluent by speaking loudly. You become fluent by practicing consistently." I laughed because the comparison made perfect sense. Over the next few weeks, I became almost too careful. Every purchase went into our family budget. Every payment was planned. I even enjoyed opening our banking app because it no longer felt confusing. Instead, it felt like another small routine helping our family stay organized. I also learned a few practical English phrases that appeared inside the app, such as available credit, statement balance, and payment due date. Reading them every month slowly improved my vocabulary without feeling like homework. Then came the mistake. One busy Friday, life became unusually hectic. Our children had school activities, we hosted relatives for dinner, and I spent the entire afternoon preparing food while answering phone calls and running errands. Late that night, completely exhausted, I glanced at my phone and noticed an email reminder from the credit card company. I smiled confidently and thought, I'll take care of it tomorrow morning. Tomorrow became the next afternoon. The next afternoon became another busy evening. When I finally opened the app, my heart sank. The payment deadline had passed. It was only a short delay, but I felt terrible. I wasn't worried because of the money. I was disappointed in myself. After everything I had learned about responsibility and consistency, I had ignored the simplest habit of all. My husband noticed the look on my face and quietly sat beside me. Instead of criticizing me, he gently said, "Everyone makes mistakes. The important thing is building systems that help you avoid repeating them." That evening, we immediately set up automatic payment reminders, calendar alerts, and account notifications. It took less than 5 minutes, yet it removed so much unnecessary stress from our lives. I realized success often depends less on willpower and more on creating good routines. That lesson changed much more than the way I managed a credit card. It changed the way I approached everyday life. I believed the difficult part was finally over. I couldn't have been more wrong. A month later, while checking our account together, my husband suddenly became unusually quiet. He stared at the screen for several seconds before slowly turning the laptop toward me. There, hidden among ordinary numbers, was one unexpected detail neither of us had anticipated, and what it revealed forced us into the most emotional conversation of our marriage. Trust is more valuable than money. When my husband quietly turned his laptop toward me, I expected to see a financial problem. Maybe a missed payment. Maybe an unexpected charge. Maybe even fraud. Instead, I saw something that looked completely ordinary, a credit report with numbers, dates, and a steadily improving score. I almost laughed and asked, "That's it?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked into my eyes and said one sentence that completely changed the direction of our marriage. "Emily, this isn't really about a credit score anymore. It's about whether we keep building trust together." In that moment, I realized the most important investment in our family had never been money. I stared at the screen, trying to understand why he sounded so emotional. The numbers were better than before. We had been paying every statement on time. Our spending stayed within the budget we created together. Everything appeared to be moving in the right direction. So why did he seem more thoughtful than excited? He reached across the table and gently held my hand. "Do you remember how nervous you were just a few weeks ago?" he asked. I smiled and nodded. "You were afraid that a credit card would control our lives." I was. "But now," he continued, "you don't ask whether the card is dangerous. You ask whether our habits are healthy. That's a completely different way of thinking." His words stayed with me long after our conversation ended. Over the next few days, I started noticing something unexpected. We were talking about money more often, but arguing much less. Every Sunday evening, after dinner, we spent 15 quiet minutes reviewing our family budget together. No blame. No criticism. Just honest conversations. If we spent a little extra one week, we simply adjusted another category the following week. Those small conversations made our marriage feel lighter instead of heavier. I realized that transparency had quietly replaced anxiety. One afternoon, while buying groceries, the cashier smiled and asked, "Would you like the receipt?" I answered naturally, "Yes, please." "Thank you." It was such a simple English conversation, but I noticed something interesting. A few months earlier, I would have focused only on saying the words correctly. Now I was relaxed enough to enjoy the conversation itself. Confidence in one part of life was beginning to influence another. That evening, my husband showed me a notebook where he had been writing small family goals. None of them were about becoming rich. One page said, "Family vacation." Another read, "Emergency savings." Another simply said, "Less stress." Seeing those words almost brought tears to my eyes. Credit wasn't helping us buy unnecessary things. It was helping us organize our future with intention. Then he smiled and confessed something that completely surprised me. "I never wanted you to love credit cards," he admitted. I looked at him, confused. "I wanted you to stop fearing something you didn't fully understand." That sentence hit me harder than I expected. Fear had been making decisions for me without my permission. Once I replaced fear with knowledge, everything else became easier. I wasn't becoming a different person. I was becoming a calmer version of myself. But life has a funny way of testing new confidence. Just when I believed our family had finally found a healthy rhythm, an unexpected conversation at the dinner table changed everything. Our youngest child looked at the credit card lying beside my wallet and asked an innocent question that neither my husband nor I saw coming. "Mom, if credit is about trust, how do children learn to build trust before they even have a credit card?" The room became completely silent. Neither of us answered right away. Because deep inside, we both knew that the next lesson wasn't going to be about banks, money, or credit scores anymore. It was going to be about the example our children watched every single day. And that realization was far more powerful than any number printed on a financial report. My children were learning from me. I thought my children were too young to notice how I handled money. I couldn't have been more wrong. The biggest surprise didn't come from a bank, a credit score, or a financial expert. It came from the smallest voice in our house. One innocent question at the dinner table made me realize that every decision I made was quietly becoming someone else's lesson. In that moment, I stopped asking, "How can I build good credit?" and started asking something much more important. What kind of example am I building every single day? The room stayed quiet after my child's question. "Mom, if credit is about trust, how do children build trust before they even have a credit card?" I looked at my husband, hoping he would answer first, but he smiled gently and waited. The question belonged to both of us. I took a deep breath. "They build trust," I said softly, "by doing the little things they promise to do." My child tilted his head. "Like cleaning my room?" I laughed. "Yes, and finishing homework, telling the truth, being kind, returning borrowed things, and admitting mistakes." He smiled proudly. "I can do that." At that moment, something unexpected happened inside me. I realized those same habits were exactly what responsible adults practiced with money. Keeping promises. Planning ahead. Being honest. Solving problems instead of hiding from them. Maybe the lesson had never really been about credit cards at all. Maybe credit was simply one reflection of character. Over the following weeks, our family created a new Sunday evening tradition. After dinner, everyone shared one promise they had kept during the week. The children talked about school projects, helping friends, and finishing chores. My husband spoke about work commitments. When it was my turn, I shared simple victories, like staying within our grocery budget or paying every bill on schedule. Those conversations were never about perfection. They were about progress. I noticed another beautiful change. Our home felt calmer. Money was no longer a mysterious topic that created tension. It became just another life skill we could discuss openly without fear. One Saturday afternoon, while shopping together at a neighborhood bookstore, my daughter picked up a children's book about saving money. She looked at me and asked, "Can money help people become happier?" Her question made me smile. I answered carefully. Money can solve some problems, but trust helps people solve many more. She nodded thoughtfully, hugged the book against her chest, and quietly said, "I want both." That simple sentence stayed with me for days. While paying for the books, the cashier smiled and asked, "Would you like to use your rewards card today?" I answered confidently, "Yes, thank you." As we walked outside, I repeated the phrase quietly in my mind. It became another natural English expression added to my vocabulary without opening a textbook. I realized learning English through real conversations was becoming one of my favorite parts of daily life. That evening, my husband looked at our monthly budget and smiled. "You know what's interesting," he said. "What?" "The numbers are improving." I laughed. "So are the conversations." He nodded. "And that's the better investment." I thought our biggest lessons were happening inside our home. Then something completely unexpected happened. A few days later, one of our neighbors invited us to a weekend barbecue. During a casual conversation in the backyard, someone asked a simple question about credit cards. Within seconds, every family around the picnic table joined the discussion. Some stories were inspiring. Others were shocking. One neighbor admitted that a single financial habit had completely changed her future. Another confessed that one tiny mistake had taken years to repair. I listened carefully, fascinated. Because for the first time, I realized our family's story was only one small piece of a much bigger picture. And what I heard next completely changed the way I understood why Americans seem to love credit cards so much, and one unexpected confession from a neighbor left the entire table speechless. The truth about American credit culture. I expected to hear people brag about luxury shopping, expensive vacations, and earning endless reward points. Instead, I heard something that completely shattered the stereotype I had carried for years. Around that backyard barbecue table, nobody talked about looking rich. Nobody tried to impress anyone. They talked about mistakes, second chances, responsibility, and trust. That was the exact moment I realized why so many Americans value credit cards, and the real reason had almost nothing to do with spending money. It was a lesson I wish someone had shared with me much earlier. The smell of grilled burgers filled the warm evening air as neighbors laughed and children chased each other across the backyard. It felt like a typical American weekend gathering. Plates were passed around. Lemonade was poured. Then someone casually asked, "What's the best financial advice you've ever received?" I expected quick answers and light conversation, but what followed felt surprisingly personal. The first neighbor smiled and held up her wallet. "My credit card didn't change my life," she said. "My habits did." Everyone nodded. Another neighbor, a retired teacher, quietly admitted that years ago he missed several payments because he believed one late bill wouldn't matter. "I was wrong," he said with a small laugh. Recovering took much longer than making the mistake. No one judged him. Instead, another friend replied, "We've all learned something the hard way." I noticed something unusual. The conversation wasn't about showing success. It was about sharing lessons. Then a young couple joined in. They explained that every Sunday evening they reviewed their weekly spending together with coffee and homemade cookies. It sounded strangely familiar because my husband and I had started doing exactly the same thing. The wife smiled and said, "The card isn't dangerous. Silence is." Couples get into trouble when they stop talking. That sentence stayed with me. As the evening continued, I realized that many American families treated credit the same way they treated exercise or healthy eating. Nobody expected perfection. They simply believed that small, consistent habits created stronger results over time. That idea reminded me of language learning. Every day I practiced a few new English expressions instead of trying to memorize hundreds at once. Little by little, conversations became easier. One neighbor noticed me smiling. "What are you thinking?" she asked. I laughed. "I'm realizing I've been learning 2 languages." She looked surprised. "English," I continued, "and the language of financial responsibility." Everyone laughed together. Later that evening, while helping clean the picnic table, I overheard 2 friends discussing credit scores. One quietly mentioned that building good credit had helped their family qualify for better financing when buying a home. Another explained that responsible credit habits had lowered financial stress because they planned ahead instead of reacting to emergencies. Their stories sounded practical, not dramatic. For the first time, I truly understood why credit matters in everyday American life. It wasn't about chasing status. It was about creating stability. On the drive home, I repeated a few English phrases I had heard naturally throughout the evening. Build good habits. Pay on time. Plan ahead. They were simple expressions, yet each one carried a life lesson far beyond vocabulary. I smiled because learning English no longer felt separated from learning about life. The two had quietly become part of the same journey. When we arrived home, my husband asked, "So, do you finally understand why Americans seem to love credit cards?" I smiled. "I think I finally understand. They don't love debt. They love freedom created by responsibility." He nodded proudly. I honestly believed that was the end of my biggest misunderstanding. But I had no idea that just 1 week later, I would open our banking app expecting an ordinary update, and discover a small change that made my heart race with excitement. That tiny number wasn't just improving our credit score. It was quietly proving that our new habits were beginning to change our future in ways I never imagined. Small habits changed my life. I never expected a tiny number on a phone screen to make my eyes fill with tears. It wasn't lottery money. It wasn't a surprise paycheck. It wasn't even a message from the bank congratulating me. It was something much smaller, and somehow much more meaningful. After months of changing little daily habits, I watched my credit score quietly climb. Most people would have seen only a number. I saw proof that ordinary choices, repeated with patience, could completely rewrite a person's future. But just when I thought everything was finally falling into place, life gave me one more unexpected test. One Monday morning, while drinking coffee before the rest of my family woke up, I opened our banking app almost out of habit. I expected the usual information, our balance, recent transactions, and upcoming payment dates. Instead, I noticed that my credit score had increased again. It wasn't a dramatic jump, but it was enough to make me stop and smile. I called my husband into the kitchen. "Look." He glanced at the screen, smiled, and gave me a quiet high five. "I knew you would get there," he said. "No," I replied, laughing. "We got there." That single word mattered. We. Because every improvement came from teamwork. We planned together. We reviewed our budget together. We reminded each other about payment dates. We celebrated progress instead of chasing perfection. I realized that healthy financial habits look surprisingly similar to a healthy marriage. Neither one depended on grand gestures. Both grew stronger through consistency. Over the following weeks, something even more interesting happened. My confidence started appearing in places completely unrelated to money. At the neighborhood bakery, I no longer hesitated when ordering. I smiled naturally and said, "I'd like a whole wheat loaf, please." At the farmer's market, I comfortably asked, "Do you accept credit cards?" Small English conversations that once felt intimidating now felt effortless. My vocabulary wasn't growing because I was studying harder. It was growing because I was living more confidently. Confidence has a strange habit of spreading. When fear disappears from one part of life, it often leaves room for growth somewhere else. One afternoon, while waiting to pick up my children from school, another parent complimented me. "You always seem so calm." I almost laughed. If she had met me a few months earlier, she would have seen someone constantly worried about making the wrong financial decision. Now, I wasn't calmer because life had become easier. I was calmer because uncertainty no longer controlled my thinking. Knowledge had quietly replaced fear. That evening, my husband and I reviewed our monthly budget as usual. Something unexpected caught my attention. We were spending almost the same amount of money as before. Our income hadn't dramatically changed either. Yet our stress level had dropped noticeably. We weren't becoming wealthier overnight. We were becoming more intentional. That realization felt incredibly freeing. Later, I remembered something our neighbor had said at the barbecue. "The card isn't dangerous. Silence is." She was right. Open conversations had become one of the greatest gifts our family had ever given itself. Before going to bed, I checked our calendar and smiled at all the small reminders we had created together: payment dates, savings goals, family dinners, birthdays, and even English practice with the children. Every reminder represented one small promise kept. Looking at that calendar, I suddenly understood that success isn't built during extraordinary moments. It's built during ordinary Tuesdays that nobody else notices. I thought I had finally learned every important lesson about credit. Then my husband surprised me again. One quiet evening, he came home carrying an envelope with an excited smile on his face. He placed it on the kitchen table and said, "Emily, I think we're finally ready for something we've been dreaming about." I looked at the unopened envelope. I had absolutely no idea what was inside. But somehow, I already knew that whatever happened next would have nothing to do with a credit card, and everything to do with the life we had quietly been building together all along. Credit built more than my score. The envelope sitting on our kitchen table looked ordinary, but it carried the biggest surprise of the entire year. I honestly thought it contained another bank statement or a routine financial notice. Instead, it became the moment I finally understood what Americans mean when they say, "Build your credit." They weren't only talking about numbers. They were talking about creating opportunities before you desperately need them. What happened after I opened that envelope changed the way I looked at my family, my future, and even myself forever. My husband slid the envelope toward me with a smile that was impossible to read. "You should open it," he said. I carefully unfolded the letter. For a few seconds, I simply stared at the words. Then I looked back at him. "Is this real?" He nodded. "It is." Because of the responsible financial habits we had practiced for months, we had qualified for better financing options than we had expected. It wasn't unlimited money. It wasn't some magical reward. It was something much more practical. We had earned more choices, better flexibility, more confidence in planning the future instead of reacting to unexpected situations. I suddenly understood something that no advertisement had ever explained. Good credit doesn't guarantee success. It simply gives responsible people more doors they can choose to open. That afternoon, we celebrated in the simplest possible way. We packed sandwiches, fruit, and lemonade and drove to our favorite community park. The children raced toward the playground while my husband and I sat quietly on a wooden bench, watching them laugh. There were no expensive restaurants, no luxury purchases, and no dramatic celebration. We were simply grateful. "I've been thinking," I told him. "About what?" "I spent so much time believing credit cards were the problem." He smiled. "And now?" "I think fear was the real problem." He squeezed my hand gently. "I was hoping you'd discover that yourself." Watching our children play, I realized something beautiful. The strongest part of our family's journey had never appeared on a financial report. It appeared in ordinary moments like this one. We communicated better, planned together, solved problems together, trusted each other more deeply than before. Money hadn't created that. Good habits had. On our way home, we stopped for ice cream. The young cashier smiled and asked, "Would you like your receipt?" Without even thinking, I answered naturally, "Yes, thank you." After we walked outside, my daughter laughed. "Mom, your English sounds so natural now." Her words made me smile even more than the ice cream. Months earlier, I had worried about every sentence. Now I simply enjoyed conversations. Learning English through daily life had quietly become part of who I was. Just like building healthy financial habits, language grew stronger through small, consistent practice. That evening, I opened my notebook and wrote one sentence across the top of a fresh page. Small choices create big futures. Looking at those words, I realized they described much more than credit. They described marriage, parenting, language learning, health, friendship. Almost everything meaningful in life grows slowly before anyone notices. Before going to sleep, my husband asked one final question. If you could go back and meet the version of yourself who was afraid of credit cards, what would you tell her? I thought carefully before answering. I wouldn't tell her to love credit cards. What would you tell her? I'd tell her to stop being afraid of learning. He smiled because he knew that answer meant everything. As I turned off the bedroom light, I believed our story had finally reached its happiest chapter. I had no idea that the greatest lesson was still waiting. The following morning, one unexpected conversation with a complete stranger reminded me that the most valuable thing we had built wasn't our credit score, our budget, or even our future plans. It was something far more powerful, and it would become the perfect ending to this entire journey. Credit builds more than numbers. The most important lesson of my entire journey didn't come from a bank, a credit card company, or even my husband. It came from a complete stranger on an ordinary morning in the United States. One simple conversation lasted less than 5 minutes, yet it answered the question that had quietly followed me since the beginning. Why do Americans seem to love credit cards so much? The answer wasn't hidden inside a financial report. It was hidden inside the way people choose to build trust, one small promise at a time. And when I finally understood that, I realized this story had never really been about money. The next morning, I stopped by my favorite neighborhood coffee shop before grocery shopping. The line moved slowly, giving everyone a chance to chat. The woman standing behind me noticed the reusable shopping bag in my hand and smiled. "I like your bag," she said. "Thank you," I replied. We started talking about everyday life, family routines, and how quickly children grow up. It was one of those ordinary American conversations that seem simple on the surface but somehow leave a lasting impression. Before we reached the counter, she mentioned that she worked as a financial counselor for local families. I laughed softly. "What a coincidence," I said. "I've spent the last few months learning more about credit than I ever expected." She smiled knowingly. "Then you've probably learned that credit isn't really about borrowing." I nodded. "But I think there's still something I'm missing." She paused for a moment before answering. "The healthiest families I work with aren't the ones with the highest incomes," she said. "They're the ones who make small promises to themselves, and keep them." Those words felt strangely familiar. Small promises. Paying a bill on time. Saving a little every month. Having honest conversations. Saying, "I'm sorry," after making a mistake. Reading one page of an English book before bed. Helping a child finish homework. Calling your parents just because you care. None of those actions seem extraordinary by themselves. Together, they quietly build a beautiful life. When I left the coffee shop, I realized I had finally found the missing piece of the puzzle. Throughout this journey, I had been asking the wrong question. Instead of asking why Americans love credit cards, I should have been asking why they value systems that reward responsibility. The card was never the destination. It was simply one small tool among many. Later that evening, our family gathered around the dining table, the same table that had started this entire story. We shared dinner, laughed at silly jokes, talked about school, weekend plans, and everyday life. Looking around the room, I smiled because I understood something that my old self would never have believed. The most valuable thing we had built wasn't our credit score. It wasn't financial flexibility. It wasn't reward points. It was trust. Trust between husband and wife. Trust between parents and children. Trust in ourselves. Even my English journey reflected the same truth. I hadn't become more confident because I memorized hundreds of words overnight. I improved because I listened, practiced, made mistakes, and kept going. One simple conversation at a time. One ordinary day after another. If you're watching this today and feeling uncertain about credit, remember this: a credit card is neither your enemy nor your best friend. It's simply a tool. What truly shapes your future is how you use it, with knowledge, discipline, patience, and honesty. Those qualities will help you far beyond your finances. As I looked at my family that evening, I quietly whispered to myself, I'm no longer afraid of learning something new. That may be the greatest reward of all. Thank you for spending this journey with me. I hope my story encouraged you not only to practice English through real-life stories but also to understand a little more about everyday life in the United States. Sometimes the smallest habits create the biggest changes, and sometimes one simple conversation can completely change the direction of a life. That's all for today. I'll create many more stories like this in the future. Please subscribe so you don't miss the next one.